Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me? I guess this is on Susan. Good evening, everyone. If anyone's looking for a seat, I have some up front over here. Thank you so much for joining us here tonight. My name is Stacy Weiss, and I'm the Special Projects Coordinator here at the Center. I would like to thank my commemorative committee for assisting me with this meaningful event, especially David Kay and Tony Taroche. Is there anybody else here? I know I saw a whole bunch of you. Aaron's here and Phil, and we had all kinds of partners. We had OHAV, Cantor Weber. We can't do this without our entire community getting together. Just a few housekeeping notes. There's a restroom in the back to your right. And in the unlikely case of emergency, we have two exits, the one that you came in on and then across the way to the right again. In the interest of time, we'll be taking written questions for Dr. Bennett. When you walked in, you should have gotten those note cards. If you still need one during her conversation, we'll be able to hand them out, not a problem. I am now honored to introduce Dr. David Kay. Rabbi.
Good evening. I am Rabbi David Kay, and I co-chair the Remembrance Events Committee for the Holocaust Memorial Resource and Education Center. The 12th century Hebrew poet Yehuda Halevi wrote, "Libi v'mizrach v'anochi b'sof ma'arav." My heart is in the east, and I am in the uttermost west. All of our hearts are in the east this evening. The war between Israel and Hamas rages on. Tonight we'll hear how hateful speech led to the November pogroms, how dangerous speech was the spark that lit the conflagration of the Holocaust. And there are surely lessons for us to be learned here in our own time. Because all of our hearts are in the east this evening, I ask you, please join me in a moment of silence. This evening's program is in remembrance of the events of the night of November 9th through 10th in 1938. On that night, 85 years ago, members of the German paramilitary SA and SS, along with Hitler Youth and civilians, damaged or destroyed 267 synagogues and over 7,000 Jewish businesses in Germany, Austria, and Sudetenland. Some 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps, and hundreds of Jews died in the attacks, including over 600 who took their own lives. Called Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, evoking the thousands and thousands of shattered windows, or the November pogroms, it clearly announced to the world what would unfold in the Holocaust in the years that followed. I ask those who are able to please rise as Cantor Jeffrey Weber from Congregation Ohev Shalom chants the traditional memorial prayer, El Malei Rachamim. El Malei Rachamim. Yochen Gabromim Ametzei Menucha Nechona Tach Kanpei Hashchina B'Mahalo Kedoshim U'Toharim Kezohar Harakia Masirim
לנשמות כל אחינו בני ישראל שנטבחו בשואה. אנשים, נשים, וטף, שנחנקו, שנשרפו, שנהרגו, שמסרו את נפשם על קידוש השם. בגן עדן תהא מנוחתם. אנא בעל הרחמים, הסתירם בשאת כנפיך לעולמים. וצרור בצרור החיים את נשמותיהם. אדוני הוא נחלתם, ינוחו בשלום על משכבותיהם, ונאמר אמן.
Thank you. Please be seated. I am Dr. Kristine Beresniova, the Vice President of Education here at the Center. We are thrilled to have you and to see so many of you who came out for this critical evening to commemorate the events of Kristallnacht, or the November pogrom. Before the Holocaust became what we know as the Holocaust, the systematic state-sponsored murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others, oppression and marginalization were happening to Jews and others in Nazi Germany that were paving the way for mass murder. Kristallnacht is a turning point in the history of the Holocaust, after which it became much more complicated to slow the speed of hatred amassing across Europe in a time of considerable political and economic instability. The West knew. The Western world saw the destruction, raising the question we still ask today. What is it we can do in the face of injustice when we see it? Tonight, we both commemorate the loss of life, thank you, and that fundamental shift in society when violence became normalized. And we also ask ourselves, how can we look backward at history to better understand our own humanity? It is with this context in mind that I am thrilled to welcome Susan Benish. She founded and directs the Dangerous Speech Project to study speech that can inspire violence and to find ways to prevent this without infringing on freedom of expression. She is also a faculty associate at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Security at Harvard University. So without further ado, please help me welcome Susan Benish.
Thank you so much for coming. Thank you for inviting me. As several of you said in our moments before this program began, there couldn't be a more important time to have this conversation. I will speak to you relatively briefly, offering some ideas, and then I look forward to your questions and to some discussion. First, before I offer you some of my my own ideas and those of my colleagues at the Dangerous Speech Project, which is, by the way, an independent research team that we like to call a think cup. We are too small to be a think tank, but we considered ourselves nonetheless a mighty cup. Think of us. All right. I noticed that the New York Times headline at the time of Kristallnacht noted that Goebbels, Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda chief, called off the violence. Technically, that's true. However, much more importantly, he unleashed it and prepared it systematically over many years. After all, Kristallnacht was in 1938. And for many years already, Goebbels and others had been preparing the people of Germany and of course, neighboring countries to condone and in some cases also to commit genocide. Goebbels wrote in his diary just before Kristallnacht, the police should be withdrawn. For once the Jews should get the feel of popular anger. That is right. I immediately gave the necessary instructions to the police and the party. In other words, he instructed the police not to intervene, knowing full well that it would be quite easy to inflame terrible violence, and that once it started, it would catch like a flame and multiply. This reminds me of the testimony of a witness after the 1994 genocide in Rwanda, in a famous trial that was called the media trial, because there were three defendants, one newspaper editor, and two executives of a radio station that became, it's known as RTLM by its French initials, but its terrible famous nickname was Radio Machete, because after all, in Rwanda, genocide of between 500,000 and 1 million people was committed by hand with machetes. So imagine how committed a significant number of people must be to mass murder in order to carry it out that way. The witness was asked, as she testified, what it was that the defendants, who after all had never touched a machete, had never committed any violence personally, what it was that they had done to bring about the genocide. And what that Rwandan witness said was, they dripped petrol, gasoline. They dripped petrol little by little all over the country so that one day you could strike a match and it would burst into flames. That is what happened on Kristallnacht. We at the Dangerous Speech Project speak often of petrol and spark. Since both are terribly important, we are particularly worried about petrol, since it's gradual and difficult to detect. Doesn't look like flame, in other words. It's, well, you know what it is. I want to read you just a little bit more about Kristallnacht. Nothing systematic seems to have been considered before the unleashing of the action of November 9th. In other words, it wasn't planned in detail. It wasn't necessary to plan it in detail because of all of that petrol that had also been dribbled all over Germany. At that moment, writes, by the way, this is from Saul Friedlander, a very significant historian of the Holocaust. At that moment, total abysmal hatred appears as the be-all and end-all of the onslaught. The only immediate aim was to hurt the Jews as badly as the circumstances allowed, by all possible means to hurt them and to humiliate them. The pogrom and the initiatives that immediately followed have been quite rightly called a degradation ritual. An explosion of sadism threw a particularly lurid light on the entire action and its sequels. I'll stop with that. As you can imagine, there are so many terrible things that one can recount regarding Kristallnacht. But I would like to try to tell you more about that petrol and how it happens that human beings individually and collectively can be shifted in the direction of condoning and even committing mass violence. Since I want to tell you one thing, if you take just one idea home with you tonight, I would perhaps want it to be this: it's not normal. It is not normal for human beings to condone or commit mass violence. It's not hardwired. On the contrary, it has happened often, sadly, throughout human history, but that's not because it comes naturally. In the words of a song from the musical South Pacific, you may know, you have to be carefully taught. No human baby has ever despised or feared another group of people until being carefully taught. So with that, let's move to the next slide. As you see, the title of my talk is also about petrol and spark, how this can happen, how this transformation can happen. Advance, please. So I am an international human rights lawyer and an international criminal lawyer by training. I spent some time contributing to prosecuting some of the people most responsible for crimes against humanity and war crimes and genocide. Doing that made me long to find a way to give at long last meaning to the famous phrase, never again, to find a way to prevent mass violence. And in the course of some legal study of hate speech and incitement to genocide, I looked at many of the statements that malevolent political leaders in many different societies and languages and cultures and even time periods have made in the months and years before an outbreak of mass violence. I had occasion to look at it in the course of this legal scholarship, and then I was stunned. It's unbelievably similar from case to case. It's as if there is some horrible school somewhere that all of these expletive deleted people go to learn how to use this kind of rhetoric, how to communicate in this way. So I thought, perhaps there's something here. If this is a consistent precursor, if this kind of usually language, but also other forms of communication is a consistent precursor to outbreaks of mass violence, and we know that it isn't normal for people to condone mass violence, something has to happen to a society to bring it about, then it seemed like at least an interesting guess that there is a connection there, that in fact language, which is the way in which humans, after all, try to get each other to do things, might be a necessary instrument for bringing about mass violence. And I was very lucky to get a grant to study this for a year, and I still haven't stopped. It was about a decade ago. So this is our, now together with my colleagues, our proposed definition of this special category, dangerous speech. It is human communication that can inspire violence between groups of people. We call it any form of expression because it's not only words, it can of course be also photographs and videos, and even in certain circumstances, a t-shirt of a particular color. So any form of expression that can increase the risk. I'm breaking down this definition for you in detail. Why increase the risk instead of cause violence? Because we continue to believe that all human beings have autonomous will, and therefore dangerous speech can't cause violence, but it can help to persuade people to commit or condone it. That people will commit or condone violence against members of another group. One more remark then on this definition. Another group, what kind of group counts? in definitions of hate speech, of which there are many, there's no consensus definition of hate speech, there is nonetheless one consistent thread, which is that hate speech is always an attack on someone, an individual or a group, based on some shared characteristic, some group characteristic. So when my kid says to me, Mama, I hate you, that's not hate speech because it's personal with me. It's not because I'm part of any group. She doesn't hate the other mamas. So there is in hate speech always this idea that someone's being attacked because they are a member of a group, and virtually all definitions of hate speech specify certain groups. The original ones emerging from the human rights law that was written after World War II, after the Holocaust, specified religion, nationality, and ethnicity. More modern definitions of hate speech have added many other kinds of groups like age, veteran status, even caste, immigration status. We at the Dangerous Speech Project don't specify any particular kinds of groups because unfortunately we have observed that dangerous speakers turn this awful, powerful rhetoric against all different sorts of groups. And so if they're doing this to a group of people, for us, that counts. Next slide, please. I've made this point to you already. It is uncanny how similar this stuff is from one case to another. However, you can't make a list of words and say, this is dangerous speech. Why not? Anybody want to hazard a guess? Yes, exactly. Also, it depends on who's talking and who's listening. I like to say to my students, no matter how terrific I think I am convinced that I can't convince you to commit mass violence, no matter what I do. It is partly because I'm not influential enough, frankly, over any group of people, this audience included. And my students are not susceptible enough. They have not been soaked in petrol, to extend that metaphor, thank goodness. So I could say to them some of the most horrifying things that the Nazis said, or some of the most terrible things that were said in Rwanda in the lead up to 1994 to the genocide or during the genocide. And it wouldn't lead my students or you to be more likely to commit that mass violence. We have to look at the context in which speech is disseminated and to whom to understand its capacity to inspire mass violence. And so we have come up with an analytical framework for doing that analysis, and I will show it to you briefly. I will also tell you a little bit about those patterns, what we call at the Dangerous Speech Project, the hallmarks of dangerous speech. There are certain characteristic patterns that we see in this kind of rhetoric or communication that, as I said, makes it so similar from case to case. So let me show you a few of those first. Next slide, please. DS, dangerous speech hallmarks. These are just a few of them. I'll show them to you quickly and then show you some examples. The first one you are undoubtedly familiar with, dehumanization. Human beings have been compared to just about any, all manner of things that are dangerous, hazardous, poisonous, contagious, damaging, threatening. So I've come to know, sadly, the word for rat and for cockroach in a tremendous variety of languages, because those are apparently universally despised creatures. And if you can convince people to think of other humans as rats or cockroaches, then it's only another smaller step to convince them to do what you would do to a pest or to vermin. People are compared also to cancer, to bacteria, to other viruses and other diseases, to dehumanize them. In keeping with the fact that you can't make a list of words that are dangerous, dehumanization is not automatically dangerous speech. So if I'm, I don't know, at a sports game and I yell out, "Those dogs," the other team, that isn't automatically dangerous speech, but dehumanization is often a hallmark. The second one is called accusation in a mirror. I didn't name it that. It was named that by a Hutu propagandist, a Rwandan Hutu propagandist whose manual for making dangerous propaganda was discovered after the genocide in Rwanda. Accusation in a mirror means, let's say you're my group and I'm a dangerous speaker. I tell you that the other group is stockpiling weapons and planning to come and wipe you out. In other words, I try to persuade you that they are going to do to you what I would like you to do to them. That's why it's mirror, as you can see. And it's a brilliant move, because if dehumanization makes violence seem acceptable, then accusation in a mirror makes it seem what? Necessary, exactly, because it's defensive now. So if violence is necessary, then it can even be made to seem virtuous. Not only morally acceptable, but virtuous. And the people who commit it now are going to be protectors and saviors and heroes within their own group. Think of the power of that. So accusation in a mirror is a brilliant technique, and it is all too common. Quickly, two more hallmarks. Assertion of attack on women and children. Also in almost every society, people, particularly men, have an extra sense of responsibility to protect women, and all adults feel a special responsibility to protect children. Isn't it so? The only thing that will galvanize people more than convincing them that they face an existential threat is to convince them that their children or their grandchildren face an existential threat. This may be familiar to you, even in our own country. Women in particular can be symbolic of an entire group. Their integrity or purity or safety can be made to stand for the integrity, purity, safety, survival of a whole group. And I'll show you a striking example of that in just a moment. And then finally, a threat to purity overlaps sometimes with this idea of a threat to women and children. There is an idea that a group itself has, in fact, this is even shared in the definition of genocide. And since there is such a thing as cultural genocide, which is wiping out the nature and the traditions of a group of people, distinct from wiping out the people themselves. So threat to group purity is the idea that the outgroup, the other group, perhaps even just one member of that other group, can pollute, besmirch, damage, or even destroy the integrity, the purity, the survival of an in-group. Let's move on to some examples of these. Dehumanization, this is, I'm ashamed of this as an American. This is an example from our own history. It's a vicious caricature of a Chinese person depicted as an octopus, as a threatening, frightening octopus. I'll take this moment to point out to you, I made one remark about hate speech that might have made you guess that I don't think hate speech is a very useful category, although it's very well known or well used, let's say. One reason for that is that hate is very difficult to define, first of all, but also it's not the operative emotion. The emotion that really matters in all of this is fear, not hatred. And so a caricature like this is made to make people fear, in this case, the Chinese. Let's look at some other, this is our definition of dehumanization. And then this is an example from Nazi Germany depicting Jews as rats. Numerous, rapidly running, frightening rats. And then this is a very recent example from the Brexit campaign in the United Kingdom. Dangerous speech is usually aimed, by the way, at an in-group. It is usually therefore indirect in its effect because it is designed to make one group of people want to attack another group of people. That is indirect. However, sometimes it is also aimed at the people it seeks to attack and diminish. So this is an example of that, since this horrible message was disseminated both in English, aimed at non-Polish speaking British people, and in Polish, to make sure that that Poles in the UK felt despised. And finally, another Nazi example. I imagine that these are relatively familiar to you, and I don't want to dwell on them any more than necessary. This is accusation in a mirror, reversing reality by suggesting that the intended targets of violence will instead commit it. And this is a cover of Kangura, which was a newspaper that circulated widely in Rwanda before the genocide, and it was full of propaganda designed to convince people to hate, but much more importantly, to fear the Tutsi people who were the prime targets of the genocide and who were in fact mass murdered. And this is, I told you that I was going to show you an image, very striking image of a woman standing in for an entire group. In this case, as you can see, a beautiful blonde woman is very explicitly standing in for Europe. The headline is "The Islamic Rape of Europe." And as you can see, male brown hands that in Europe can easily be assumed to be those of Muslim men are attacking this woman. Just in case the message is not explicit enough, her dress is made of the European flag. And finally, threats to group purity. There's a famous Nazi example which said, just one Jew is like a rotten apple that can spoil the entire barrel. In other words, if you put one rotten apple into a barrel of unspoiled apples, they will all be spoiled quickly. And this is another example from the United States. Let's move on. And then there's one more hallmark I haven't yet described to you, and that is attacking members of an in-group, often just as ferociously as if they were members of an out-group. I picked a US example, rhinos, Republicans in name only. I'm sure you're familiar with that. And of course, order your rhino hunting permit together with an image of someone holding a rifle is a frightening and rather obvious message. And then just a little bit more about hate speech and dangerous speech. Hate speech is a big, vague, contested category, since there are a variety of definitions. In practice, it often ends up meaning the speech that is distressing, offensive, hateful from my own perspective. I should stop and say, there is, of course, hate speech that is obviously hate speech, about which there would be no argument, but there are some fuzzy lines around the edge. It overlaps quite a bit with dangerous speech, but thank goodness there's quite a bit of hate speech that isn't dangerous, again, because of the speaker and the audience and so forth. And then there's quite a lot of dangerous speech that isn't hateful, as I've already suggested to you. You can make one group of people fear another one very much without needing to make them feel hatred. If I convince you that another group is stockpiling weapons and planning to attack you, that might well be dangerous without being hateful. Let's go on. So this is quickly the analytical framework for understanding which speech is dangerous. We look at the message itself. We look for hallmarks. We consider who the speaker is when there is a speaker. Of course, sometimes in digital communication, for example, the speaker is unknown, but many speakers are particularly influential for a variety of reasons. Audiences can be especially susceptible, again, for a variety of reasons. The context social and historical context can be enormously influential in making speech dangerous. It can constitute that petrol or gasoline that I was telling you about. And finally, the medium can matter. Sometimes one particular radio station is by itself highly influential. So the fact that a message was transmitted over those radio waves or by means of a particular social media app in certain circumstances can make a big difference. Let's go on. Now, I'd like to close with a little bit of not so gloomy information, some ideas. What can one do about this? There is a kind of moral panic now about the internet. You know, in the 1990s, lots of people thought it was going to solve all of human problems. We've done something like a 180 from there, and now lots of people would say that online communication is something of a cesspool. It's full of awful content. Responses to that, discussions about what are the best policies to fix it, focus almost entirely on two kinds of actors. The companies, tech companies, you know, how will Mark Zuckerberg or how should Mark Zuckerberg solve all of this on the one hand, or in some cases, governments. But even when there's discussion about how governments should fix the internet, it's usually what governments should do to get Mark Zuckerberg and company and, you know, other people to fix it all. So at the Dangerous Speech Project, we reasoned that that's not enough. That is entirely top down. It's, by the way, almost all of those policies are conducted in not quite secret, but large, let's say, behind very opaque veils. There are 4 billion of us who are online, and something like, what's the world population now? Have we gotten to 6, 7 billion? 8 billion. We are all communicating, even if not online. And in human society, in human history, informal norms, informal human communication have been much more powerful than law in directing what people do, in influencing how human beings behave. So we thought it's worth taking a look at what possibilities there are from the rest of us, from grassroots. I want to be careful to say, I'm not suggesting that grassroots responses to dangerous speech or other harmful content can be enough or can replace top-down regulation by companies or governments, just that they shouldn't be completely ignored. So we began to study, to look to see what somebody out there might be doing to respond to harmful content. About 5 years ago, we went spelunking around, you know, the digital world, digital spaces, looking for this. And we're stunned to discover that there are hundreds of thousands of people who have taken this on as usually a voluntary, almost always a voluntary effort. They spend enormous amounts of their spare time doing it. And that's a gigantic opportunity, at least to study what they're doing and what sort of effects it's having. I think also very likely it's presenting some really useful models. I am here. Is there anybody in the room who speaks Swedish? Safe. Okay. Because I don't speak Swedish, but I'm going to try to pronounce a little bit of Swedish and was hoping not to get in too much trouble. Jag går här, something like that, means I am here in Swedish. And it is the name that an extraordinary Swedish woman named Mina Dennert gave to her effort that she began in a completely informal, spontaneous way in response to a tremendous surge of xenophobia and hatred in Sweden in 2013 and 2014. She began responding to people in a civil way. That's one of her #1 rules. She would respond, and you can imagine that's not a lot of fun. She continued for a while and then was getting exhausted. So she asked some of her friends and colleagues to join. And then more and more and more people joined. And now there are more than 100,000 people taking part in this just in Sweden, and more than 1,000 take part at least once a week. My colleague, Kathy Berger, our director of research, did the first ethnographic study of counter speakers, studying these yogerher, these I am here participants in Sweden. I'll be happy to provide the link. It's a fascinating study. This model has now been replicated in more than 14 other countries. There's an Ich bin here in Germany, for example. There's one in Norway. There's a lovely one in Canada. We have a little one, unfortunately, it should be bigger, in the United States. In each country, as you can imagine, it's called I am here in the relevant language. So that is one of the biggest counter-speaking operations we know about. They use Mina's strict set of rules. She's quite a leader. So there is a very strong set of rules for participants in I am here when they respond to hatred and dangerous speech online. I'm grinning because I'll just tell you sort of confidentially that one of the interviewees said that sometimes she just can't bear to stick to the rules. And so she responds not using the I am here hashtag. When she just can't kind of, sometimes it's very hard to behave yourself. But again, hundreds of thousands of people are doing this, and it's a remarkable natural experiment. Next slide, please. Just two more, and then the floor is yours. It is commonly, you've probably heard that maxim, don't feed the trolls, which suggests that there's no point in responding to people who express hateful or harmful views, or who spread disinformation. There are reasons not to respond in some cases. However, the implication that is often also shared, or the assumption that people make that you can never succeed, isn't quite right. Megan Phelps Roper is the granddaughter of Fred Phelps. Fred Phelps was the founder of the Westboro Baptist Church in Kansas. It sounds as if some of you have heard of Westboro. Okay, there are the people who picketed in many different locations, including Jewish cultural and Jewish festivals of various kinds, and the funerals of American soldiers with horrible, hateful, and violent signs. Megan grew up from her earliest childhood marching and carrying those signs. And when she was a young teenager, she started a Twitter account when Twitter was still Twitter, to more effectively spread the messages of the church, which are violently homophobic and various other violently hateful messages. Some people began responding to her on Twitter, including, I'm proud to tell you, a rabbi who took on some of her dogmatic or religious assertions, some of her references to the Old Testament and her interpretations of them struck him as a little off, as you might imagine. So he responded and argued with her. And she's very smart woman. She couldn't resist replying again. And then he replied and she replied. And then he asked her how she was doing. And of course, he asked her what she was eating, as a Jew, and what music she was listening to and so forth. So it was, as she has described in her extraordinary book called Unfollow, there was a kind of parallel human engagement going on. There was the impassioned debate between two people. And then there was the empathy side of things. And then there was a lawyer who began debating with her as well. Let me get to the punchline. She left the church and left her family and married one of the guys who had been engaging with her on Twitter, and now is a counter speaker trying to undermine her own prior extremist views. You know, it's not common, but this case is at least instructive and extraordinary. I want to tell you one more thing about the counter speakers of I Am Here, by the way. They said almost to a person that their goal is not to convert, to reform the person to whom they are responding. Many of them said, I'm not crazy. I don't think I'm going to magically transform a neo-Nazi. I am addressing myself to the audience, to the much larger group of people who are quietly watching exchanges online. And that seems to me terrifically important, because in order to get mass violence, you have to convince not one person or two people. You have to begin to shift norms within a critical mass of people in a society. So the audience is indeed much more important. Those teenagers who are reading what's going on online and wondering what sort of behavior, what sort of speech is acceptable and what isn't. Those are the people that I shouldn't say that the counter speakers at I Am Here in all of their different countries and groups are really trying to influence. And let me end with one more example of counter speech. I think there's one more slide. Reconquista Germanica is a neo-Nazi, violently anti-Semitic hate group in Germany that was very active online. And then a group of counter speakers was organized against them called Reconquista Internet. Reconquista as in reclaim, reconquer. The hate group wanted to reclaim Germany, and then the counter speakers wanted to reclaim the internet. And there have been some very interesting scholarly studies on the effects of that effort. So it's just to tell you that there's stuff one can do. And then I'd like to close by also acknowledging more specifically that this is a fantastically difficult time, even to talk about these things and to think about these things, and to thank you again for coming.
Iterate the instructions. Thank you, Susan. We are happy to take questions because there is such a large number of you. And Susan has another commitment to get to. We're going to take them in written form. So if you just take 1 minute to jot down any questions you have, they'll be passed up front to me, and then I will get them to Susan, and she will be locked here at the podium answering every one of your questions until midnight. No, I'm kidding. That's a joke.
I didn't think you would have any questions.
Sorting through to make sure we don't have duplicates. Some of these I don't think are questions. So please make them questions. I think I have to put notes.
Here's, shall I just because there are so many, let me start with a wonderful question. In your definition of dangerous speech, how are you defining violence? I wonder only because words themselves are violent and enact violence by their very existence. I.e., felt has physical consequences. Yes. In other words, words can themselves have significant physical consequences. We have debated this. Thanks so much for the question. It's something I probably should have already mentioned. We debated this very extensively, and with mixed feelings settled on the definition that is used, for example, in the United Nations documents on violence against women. We do define it as physical violence. And the main reason is that the other, as you point out, very significant consequences of language that indeed can be very painful are more difficult to capture at scale. In other words, since those consequences are so personal, it is very difficult to capture them outside of the person who is experiencing them, if you see what I'm saying. They are very important without any question, and they are quite subjective. So it was harder to incorporate that kind of a definition of violence, to define a category of content that one would then want to be able to use. For example, if you're a social media company or somebody trying to do interventions at scale. Oh. This one, I'm sorry, I'm a little emotional. How do you maintain your well-being while studying this terrifying subject? My main answer is that I have an enchanting 4-year-old daughter. It's true. And for example, over the last month, I've really struggled with this because I don't want her to see how I really feel. But you know what kids are like. She sees everything. I garden, I knit, I ride my bike, lots of things to try to distract myself. I also want to honor this very kind question by telling you that I was born into it. On Kristallnacht, my mother was still a schoolgirl in Germany, in Berlin. And when she was dragged out of school by the police, one of her classmates, my mother almost never spoke about it, but one of the few things she told me was that a little school mate of hers asked the teacher, why are they dragging Ruti away? And the teacher's answer was, translated from German, Ruti didn't do it on purpose. In other words, her being Jewish was not a thing it's not a sin that she committed herself. So I in some ways I feel like I gotta do something. Maybe that's part of it also. I hope so much that this something is something. I don't know. Okay, next question. What questions, my goodness. Okay. What's the most effective thing the average college student can do to combat harmful rhetoric? Just before walking in, I read a blog post by Robert Reich that a friend and colleague sent to me. He addressed himself in that post to his children, and then he quickly explains that he says, I'm really worried about my children. And then he says, not my biological children, they're fine. I mean my students. And I love that. He went on to say that his Jewish students have come to him and told him that they're really frightened. And then also his Muslim students have come to him and told him that they're really frightened. And nobody can talk to anybody anymore. So I commend to you this beautiful blog post. He implores them all not to replicate even in the smallest way what's going on, in the Middle East. So I I think the average college student can call out harmful rhetoric with calmness. Think about Mina Dennert and her rules demanding civility. Call out harmful rhetoric, but in a civil and empathetic way, and try to both communicate your own concerns and your own distress, and as Reich says, communicate that you understand your fellow students as humans as well. I think that by itself is a significant gesture, together with calling out the harmful rhetoric and maybe explaining to people why it's harmful. We already saw mass violence here on January 6th. Yeah, it wasn't very far from my house. Can you apply what you said tonight to the anti-Semitism in the US? Absolutely. You know, if I started the Dangerous Speech Project as a genocide prevention project. And in the beginning of our work, we worked on countries at, we would say, appreciable risk of mass violence. Faraway countries, not post-industrial, modern, democratic countries. Now, if I had a dime for every time somebody had said to me, did you think you were going to work this much on your own country? On my own country and other countries, for example, in Western Europe, where I see rising dangerous speech. I would think, like the counter speakers, that you need not persuade or transform the people who are really suffused with hatred, who are well soaked in petrol, in order to have a significant impact. Try to reach people who are not drenched. I as you can tell, I'm really making a lot of use of this metaphor, and I should clarify that petrol is not dripped everywhere equally, especially given online communication. Some people are getting completely soaked with it, while others are just getting a little bit. And it seems tremendously important to try to catch people, especially young people, who are a little exposed but not completely drenched yet. I fear tremendously for many countries since October 7th. I have to be honest with you. Couple more long ones. Okay. Hang on a sec. Okay. Without trying to be partisan, that's what made me smile. How would you describe or relate the speech of the former president of which country? Which former president? Okay. All right. All right. In relation to the conversation tonight on hate speech or drips of petrol, where are we now in the US? Not trying to be partisan either, but I'll answer the question. There are many dangerous speakers in the United States, as in many countries. The former president of whom I think you speak is particularly good at speech that is not obviously dangerous, but that is nonetheless significantly dangerous. I'll give you one example. During his last campaign, he recited many, many, many times a poem that is also a song. It's called The Snake. And the poem describes a sweet woman who comes across an injured snake. And out of the out of compassion, takes the snake home and nurses it back to health. And then the snake viciously, venomously bites her. And as she's dying, she says, "Why did you do this to me? I saved your life." And he says, "Stupid woman, stupid, maybe old. I don't remember whether she's old, but anyway, stupid woman. You knew perfectly well that I was a poisonous snake, and nonetheless, you deserve to die for your stupidity." And the way that the former president interprets this, the woman is Democrats and or Jews. He's never actually said Jews, but you know how that is. Who in their foolishness or wickedness allow dangerous people to come in to the country and harm Americans. So it's an anti-immigrant. It's a really powerful, subtle but powerful anti-immigrant message that can very easily be trained on a variety of different groups. And it's ingenious because it also does this demonizing of in-group members. After all, there are two baddies in that poem. It also, the way that the former president has used this poem also demonstrates a principle that Joseph Goebbels famously pointed out, which is that repetition is very effective for driving home any message, including a very bad and dangerous one. And in the course of his last campaign, former President Trump got his audiences so used to that poem that they would beg him to recite it. And he had this whole kind of call and response thing where he would say, "You want me to recite the poem?" And they'd say, "Yeah, go recite the poem." "I don't know." "Yeah, come on," so that it's the audience that is calling for something, demanding a message, which has its own special power. Sorry, I know I went on a long time. But again, he's far from the only one, and there are dangerous speakers with lots of different perspectives and points of view and affiliations and so forth. Okay. Election poll workers have been targeted. How can the narrative be changed? That is a very important question because much of what was said about the election poll workers, as far as I know, all of the dangerous speech about them was false as well. So there's another really important point, which is that disinformation, about which so many people are talking all the time, overlaps tremendously with dangerous speech. Dangerous speech is so often also false. So that's another thing for the person who asked about what college students can do. You can also point out when things are wrong or false. It's difficult to persuade people, it's true, but it's just like counter speech itself, it doesn't always fail. It does sometimes work and is worth a try. So regarding the poll workers, all kinds of things can be done, of course, to protect them, but starting with a very strong campaign to debunk those lies. And another important point about dangerous speech and counter speech, coming back to the analytical framework, the speaker matters a lot. So if you can persuade somebody who is influential over a particular group to spread a useful message, that will make much more difference than if the message comes from an outsider. That's pretty obvious, but in practice, it's rarely attempted. So I will finally close. Hang on, I guess there's one more question, but I have to mention to you, there's a wonderful book by a scholar called Ashutosh Varshney on intercommunal violence in India. Dr. Varshney noticed that there are some cities which have had terrible episodes of violence over and over and over, and other cities that are quite similar demographically and in other ways that somehow didn't have these terrible riots and killings and violence. So he studied in great detail and came up with a variety of findings. The one I want to call out to you, which was one of the main findings in this work, is that it was where leaders of different communities had pre-existing ties, that when tensions rose, those leaders could contact one another and agree to calm down their own respective groups. That did a tremendous amount to forestall intergroup violence. So that's relevant also in the United States. We haven't tried it nearly enough. And finally, the AI is watching. I push back. I can't believe we got this far without mentioning AI, right? I push back against bad stuff on LinkedIn because not only are there others reading, but also AI is learning from our discourse. Have you studied how valid of a rationale is this thinking? Is it the thinking that AI is learning from our discourse, do you mean? I just want to make sure I understand the question. That's a terrific question. AI, artificial intelligence, now with large language models, can do incredible things. The AI is only still as good as the people who are building the large language models and the classifiers, which are tools to detect certain kinds of content. And in fact, on Friday, I'm going to a really interesting conference in California to talk about how AI can better be used to detect the kinds of content that really matter. So stay tuned.
Good evening, everyone. Wow, thank you so much, Susan Benish. Your work is so critical in this moment in history. We're so grateful that you were able to share your wisdom with us. For those of you that I haven't had the chance to meet yet, I'm Tali Dippold. I'm the CEO of the Holocaust Memorial Resource and Education Center, and I'm so grateful that you joined us this evening to learn more about how speech can lead to violence. I couldn't take enough notes, and I can't wait to incorporate what I learned into my own messaging. At the Holocaust Center, we take our mission to use the history and lessons of the Holocaust to build a just and caring community free of anti-Semitism and all forms of prejudice and bigotry very seriously. Now more than ever, it is important that we educate and model for our students and society what we can achieve together. What's really going to stick with me tonight is that no one is born hating, that we have the opportunity to ensure that through education, we can teach them. So yes, they might be getting a lot of it at home and in different places, but as long as they're not soaked in the petrol yet, we still have an opportunity. I'm excited to announce we're focusing on good news. As you can see, we're bursting at the seams here. So we're excited to announce that we're going to be breaking ground on a new Holocaust Museum for Hope and Humanity in late 2024. As you exit, you'll be able to see some more information. I just wanted to make sure that I gave the quick sneak peek. This is a rendering of our new spectacular facility. You'll see that it is in the shape, hopefully you can see from this picture, of a shofar, a ram's horn, used in in Judaism as a call to action. And because we're breaking ground in 2024 and opening in 2026, this museum will be a call to action to the local community to send the message that only through education can we combat this hatred that has taken a hold of our society at the moment. We envision a world where individuals take action to fight prejudice, anti-Semitism, and intolerance wherever they encounter it. We hope you'll join us on this journey. Our mission will be to inspire people, young and old, to embrace the lessons of the Holocaust, to engage diverse communities with eyewitness testimonies to the Holocaust and other genocides, to teach individuals to recognize the signs of prejudice and intolerance, to empower visitors to promote human dignity in their daily lives, and to reach local and worldwide audiences in the fight against hate. We have a very unique opportunity because of where we're located to really be at the core of this incredible work. I hear the question a lot, what can I do? I get calls every day, everything from Instagram, TikTok, you name it. People are saying, what can we do? What can we do? So by bringing speakers like Susan Benish here, we're offering opportunities for you to get involved, to find ways to help. I'd also like to suggest that each one of you tonight visits our website, or we have QR codes floating around where you can take a pledge tonight to end hate, to make hate history together. It seems like something minor, this pledge, but believe me, when we go out in the community and talk about how many individuals we're reaching with our work, it does make a huge difference. We also hope you'll continue to join us at our upcoming events. On November 30th, we have a discussion with Alan Hall, a Holocaust survivor and author of a book, Hiding in Plain Sight, who shares his story about the rare moments he dramatically avoided being sent to the notorious Treblinka death camp. And he spent time in 10 displaced person camps after the war before finding a place to go. So that'll be a fascinating discussion. Then we have International Holocaust Remembrance Day with former diplomat and communications officer from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, Arthur Berger, who will speak about the role of the American diplomats and the role they played and didn't play in rescuing Jews during the Holocaust. That's in January. And in February, we have a new exhibit that's opening, Basic Judaism, which speaks to the all-important theme that you'll hear a lot about, encountering the other. And that'll be in February. So we're thrilled that you were able to join us this evening. And thank you so much. And we look forward to seeing you at one of our upcoming events. Thank you and have a great evening. So much. I know. Thank you. Thank you. So fabulous.
And SOJC,
Yeah.
you have a holiday.
Okay.
Fabulous. The organization is that.
Yeah. Wow, fabulous. Thank you. We will add it to our collection. Thank you. Thank you so much. I'll tell Christine all about it. Holocaust person. You got Holocaust Flora?
No. It was ready in SOJC.
Oh, great.
I'm sort of the one that's in charge of
Fabulous.
painting and so on.
Wonderful.
So when
Thank
I
you.
saw this, I mean, I found it like a month.
Fabulous. Wonderful. Thank you for thinking about us. Thank you. Being here. Thank you. Okay.